This one won't be controversial at all now, will it? I thought it best that I try to tackle this topic in the most unbiased way that I can. So, for the next segment of this video, I am just going to read official church teaching in the form of readings from church councils, rulings from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly known as the CDF, from Papal Bulls, encyclicals, Moto Proprios, and even just some readings from the Fathers of the Church. And then I'll let you decide what you think the church's teaching on slavery has been, if it's changed, and if it's changed, how it's changed. Notably, I am only gathering these Catholic teachings from Catholic sources. On the pro-slavery side, I'm actually reading from the Traditional Catholic subreddit from a post titled Traditional Doctrine on Slavery. In that post, a certain Reddit radtrad is arguing that the modernists are wrong to denounce slavery as always wrong, and he argues that slavery itself is in fact morally permissible. For my anti-slavery post, I went with Rodney Stark's Bearing False Witness, Debunking Centuries of Anti-Catholic History. Thank you, Kyle, for sending me this book. Chapter 8 of this book is dedicated to debunking the idea that the church was always pro-slavery, and I got most of my anti-slavery Papal Bulls and my Aquinas quotes from this chapter. With that, let's jump into it. I will be presenting these readings in chronological order, starting at the earliest points of church history and then coming to modern day, just about. I also have the origin and the type, as well as a link to these actual readings from these various sources. I will have this exact spreadsheet linked in the video description if you want to check my sources. And as always, I encourage you, check my sources and think for yourself. Starting in the year 340 from the Synod of Gangra, Canon 3. Anyone shall teach a slave under pretext of piety to despise his master and to run away from his service, let him be anathema. In the year 1179, with regard to the Brabanters, the Aragonese, the Navarrese, the Basques, the Cotarelli, and the Triaverdini, their goods are to be confiscated, and their princes free to subject them to slavery. Notably, this is almost like a revenge reading, where these people had been enslaving Christians, so in this church council, the church was giving permission for Christians to enslave them back. In 1215, we decree that those who sell them galleys or ships, those who act as pilots in the pirate Saracen ships, or give them any advice, or by way of machines or anything else to the detriment of the Holy Land, are to be punished with deprivation of their possessions and are to become slaves of those who capture them. So here a church council was giving permission to enslave people who are helping the Saracens, the Muslims. In 1250, nothing is so repugnant to human nature as slavery. Oh, okay. So in 1250, suddenly we have an anti-slavery statement made by Doctor of the Church, Thomas Aquinas. 1435, they restore to their earlier liberty all and each person of either sex who were once residents of said Canary Islands and made captives since the time of their capture, and who had been made subject to slavery. These people are to be totally and perpetually free. That was a papal bull in which the Pope was declaring that anybody who had been made a captive in the Canary Islands has to be set free. So again, another anti-slavery papal bull. We, therefore, weighing all and singular the premises with due meditation, and nothing that since we had formerly by other letters of ours granted, among other things, free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. So here's a papal bull only 20 years after the papal bull that commanded that the slaves in the Canary Islands be set free, in which this bull, this pope, was granting permission to a certain king to take slaves. 1537. The said Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be deprived of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ. This was another papal bull. And this one is notable because this papal bull specifically says, don't enslave them even if they're not Christians. Because previously, slavery was kind of a sometimes permissible option, but never permissible for other Christians. And sometimes it was customary to free your slaves if they convert to Christianity. But if your slaves stay whatever religion they were, particularly Judaism, they are to remain slaves. 1548, a Moto Proprio from Pope Paul III. With apostolic authority, we enact and decree in perpetuity that the slaves who flee to the capital and appeal for their liberty shall in no ways be freed from the bondage of their servitude, but shall be returned in slavery to their owners, irrespective of whether they were made Christians after enslavement, or whether they were born into slavery even from Christian slave parents according to the provisions of common law. This is a motu proprio that is saying that even Christian slaves must stay slaves. So there seems to be a waffling back and forth here. 1566, to enslave a free man or appropriate the slave of another is called man-stealing. And so this is from the Catechism of the Council of Trent under the 7th Commandment section, where the Council of Trent is saying that it's actually a sin to enslave a free man or to steal somebody else's slave. It's not entirely clear to me if freeing somebody's slave would count as stealing, but it does read that way. 1569, a papal bull. They shall become slaves of the Roman Church, live in perpetual servitude, and the Roman Church shall have the same rights over them as the worldly lords over slaves and property. This is specifically referring to the Jews, by the way. In 1639, Pope Urban VIII forbids anyone to keep them in slavery, referring to the Indians of the West or the South. So, awesome. 1639, a papal bull that seems to condemn slavery. This is perhaps the most damning thing that I included on this list. 1866, from the Instructions of the Holy Office, the name for the organization that is now the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, which was called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith up until last year. Slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to the natural and divine law. And there could be several just titles of slavery, and these are referred to by approved theologians and commentators of the sacred canons. From this, it follows that it is not repugnant to the natural and divine law that a slave be sold, bought, exchanged, or given, as long as in this sale, or buying, or exchange, or giving, the due conditions, which those same approved authors widely follow and explain, are properly observed. Notably, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith does carry the power of infallibility when they speak as all of the bishops, and when they speak on matters of faith and morals. There are certain conditions under which the DDF can speak infallibly, and these are defined in other church documents, but this certainly seems to meet the criteria of infallibility for the DDF. And the DDF clearly says here that slavery is not contrary to natural or divine law. And then lastly, skipping to just about modern day, this is something from Vatican II. Whatever insults human dignity, such as slavery, is an infamy indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than to those who suffer from the injury. Moreover, they are supreme dishonors to the Creator. The Vatican II is clearly calling slavery a dishonor to God. At this point, I would just ask you to make up your own mind. I've read you papal bulls, councils, doctors of the church, and there seems to be arguments on both sides. I can't tell you what to think the church's stance on slavery is, but at the end of this video, I will tell you what my opinion is. But before we go there, I do want to quickly discuss my opinions on Bearing False Witness by Dr. Rodney Stark. I thought that this book was good, but definitely still an apologetic work, so it definitely was biased. It completely omits from chapter 8 any papal bull or church council teaching that goes against its point, which strikes me as a little bit odd. Dr. Stark seems way more concerned with supporting his tribe than he does with presenting as complete an information set as possible. And the thing is that I actually do agree with the premise of chapter 8. And the premise of chapter 8 is just that people are unfairly critical of the church when it comes to the slavery issue. And I think that's right. I do think that people are unfairly critical of the church. In fact, people like Thomas Aquinas were arguing against, kind of, arguing against slavery as early as, the 1200s, the 13th century. Mainline Protestantism held on to slavery much longer than Catholicism did. In fact, most of the world held on to slavery longer than Catholicism did. I'm actually of the mindset that the church was pretty good on slavery. We live in a pretty screwed up world, and the church seems to be a little bit less screwed up than the rest of the world when it comes to slavery, at least proportionally less screwed up, if that makes sense. But I just thought it was weird that Dr. Stark didn't include a single church council that seemed to support slavery, and there's a good number of them. So it just seems to me that Dr. Stark is really only interested in making the church look as good as possible instead of just presenting all the information, then, letting the chips fall where they may. And then my second critique is Dr. Stark's stance on Thomas Aquinas. On page 170, Dr. Stark says the following. He says that Thomas, quote, placed slavery in opposition to natural law, deducing that all rational creatures are entitled to justice. Hence, he found no basis for the enslavement of one person by another. I don't think it's that simple. This article, Slavery in the Writings of Thomas Aquinas, paints a considerably less optimistic picture of Aquinas' stance on slavery than Dr. Stark does. The paper states that, quote, Thomas Aquinas recognizes the legitimacy of slavery by nature, and in this restricted sense of slavery, one can fairly say that Thomas, quote, supported slavery. By this restricted sense of slavery, the author Ralph Neal argues that Aquinas, just like Aristotle, saw slaves as part of a complete household. The natural order of a household went something like this. The husband or the father leads the household, with children and the wife, the mother, being immediately subordinate to the father. Slaves then are subordinate to the mother and the children, who are subordinate to the father. Animals are subordinate to the slaves, and then non-living tools are subordinate to even the animals. But notably, Aristotle and Aquinas definitely did both consider slaves to be tools, to be used by the legitimate owners of those tools. On page 15 of this essay, the paper concludes, Thomas's position on slavery can be summarized as follows. Following Aristotle, Thomas believes that some people are, through an intellectual limitation often influenced by race, natural slaves because it is in their own best interest. These slaves are not to be abused, but can be physically punished for their own instruction. They should be trained in virtue by their masters to whatever level they are able to attain. They can marry and even in some circumstances be ordained as priests. In contrast to Aristotle, Thomas is more consistently opposed to conventional slavery. In general, he finds this form of slavery abhorrent. One exception is that Thomas tolerates economic slavery or indentured servitude. A debt must either be paid off or else explicitly forgiven by the creditor. Before criticizing Thomas's position on slavery, one must first consider that the word slavery in English is a politically charged word that is almost always associated with the inexcusable, financially motivated African slave trade of the 15th to 19th centuries. Thomas would have considered this type of slavery to be abhorrent to our nature. One could not consider this a form of natural slavery because the forcible removal of Africans from their homelands and their transportation to plantations in South America and the southern United States was clearly not for their benefit. And the fact that they had no debt to repay also rules out the economic form of conventional slavery. But given the limited knowledge of foreigners and the different economic system of the 13th century, Thomas's position on slavery is rational and consistent. So I don't think that Dr. Rodney Stark was painting Thomas in the most accurate light. Instead, I think he was being very kind to Thomas Aquinas and more or less arguing that Thomas argued that slavery was always wrong, and I don't think that's the case. But again, this is a nuanced position that I think that Thomas has, and so I'm not trying to denounce the Catholic Church or Thomas Aquinas the way that the modern media does. I actually do not think that the church is nearly as bad on the slavery issue as what, modern media would have you think. And that's why I said I mostly agree with chapter 8 in bearing false witness. And for my own opinion, whatever my opinion is worth, I do think that the church's stance on slavery was pretty pro-slavery until slavery started to die out in Europe. Then, just like in the secular world, the church became anti-slavery. Then slavery kind of became a thing again during the colonial period, and the church put out some more pro-slavery stuff. And then once the colonial slavery period died down, the church became anti-slavery again. The 1866 writings from the DDF, formerly known as the CDF, the one that says slavery by itself considered as such in its essential nature is not at all contrary to the natural and divine law, and therefore there can be several just titles of slavery, is probably the worst one, since this one seems to meet the infallible status coming from the DDF, and it being relatively recent in only 1866. And I think that Catholics in good standing have to admit that there is some version of slavery that is morally permissible, and that probably makes some Catholics pretty uncomfortable, but I think that's just an uncomfortable truth that Catholics in good standing have to accept. Catholics, tell me where you disagree. I would love to get into it with you in the comments down below. I'm sure that there's lots to talk about. Thanks, everybody.